Over 3,000 years ago, the known world existed. Powerful, connected, thriving civilizations. And then, they just stopped existing. I'm not talking about a city. I'm not talking about a kingdom. I'm talking about almost all the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East collapsing in just 50 years. The Hittite Empire, which had challenged Egypt in the biggest battle of ancient times, vanished without a trace of its last kings. Mycenae, the civilization that inspired the Iliad and the Odyssey, was abandoned. Ugarit, the biggest trading port in the Mediterranean, was burned down and never lived in again. Cities that had stood for centuries were set on fire and buried under centuries of silence. But what makes this collapse truly disturbing isn't the destruction. It's the silence that came after. For centuries, humanity forgot that these civilizations had ever existed. Writing disappeared from entire regions. International trade stopped. Humanity, in a way, regressed. This is the story of the greatest civilizational collapse before the fall of Rome. And what modern archaeology has discovered in the last 20 years radically changes everything we thought we knew about it. To understand the magnitude of the collapse, we first have to understand what existed. And what existed was, in many ways, amazing. Around 1200 BC, the Mediterranean world was surprisingly globalized. Egyptian pharaohs exchanged letters in Babylonian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the time, like English today, with Hittite kings, with the king of Cyprus, with the rulers of Ugarit in what is now Syria. There was an international diplomatic system. There were trade treaties. There were political marriages that spanned thousands of kilometers. The merchant ships carried Cypriot copper, Afghan tin, lapis lazuli from Badakhshan, African ivory, Baltic amber, Cretan olive oil. The trade route that connected Egypt with the Aegean, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia was so active that archaeologists have called it the first international trade network in history. It wasn't primitive or sporadic. It was systematic, regulated, and interdependent. Here comes something most documentaries leave out. Archaeologists discovered in the coastal city of Ugarit a collection of clay tablets that worked like the emails of the time. Correspondence between kings, between merchants, between officials. And among those tablets, they found something chilling. A letter dated around 1185 BC, sent by the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus, said something like, "The enemy is coming with ships. My cities are being burned. There is no man who can defend them. Save my people." The reply never came. Ugarit was destroyed shortly after and was never inhabited again. But the most disturbing thing is this detail: the tablet was found in the oven where it was being baked to harden before being sent. The messenger never got to leave. The city fell before the ink could dry. This moment is a window into the horror of what happened. An entire civilization, in the middle of a distress message, was wiped off the map. The Ugarit archive is the ancient equivalent of reading someone's last messages seconds before everything collapses. And Ugarit was not alone. In just a few decades, Troy fell. Mycenae was abandoned. Tiryns, Pylos, Asini. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled Anatolia for 4 centuries and signed the first known peace treaty in history, with Ramses II of Egypt himself, disappeared. Its capital, Hattusa, was burned, and its kings were never mentioned again in any known historical record. The case of the Hittite Empire is perhaps the most mysterious of all. And there's one detail that almost nobody mentions, because it changes everything. The Hittites were, in their time, the most feared military power in the world. They invented the 3-man war chariot, the dominant military technology of their era. They fought Egypt to a draw at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, possibly the battle with the most chariots in ancient history, with tens of thousands of soldiers on the field. They signed with Ramses II the first verified peace treaty in history, whose silver copy hung in the palace of Hattusa, and whose papyrus copy was kept in the Egyptian archives at Pyramus. 2 superpowers. 1 treaty. A peace that lasted decades. This is the world that collapsed. But here's the secret that history books overlook: in the years leading up to the collapse, the Hittites were already in deep crisis. The tablets from the Hattusa archive reveal something devastating. The Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, the last known king of the empire, wrote to the king of Ugarit asking for grain. Grain. The power that had challenged Egypt for generations was starving. Researchers Eric Klein and Trevor Bryce have shown with paleoclimatic evidence that northern Anatolia was suffering from chronic drought in the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. Crops failed year after year. Military logistics collapsed because there was no way to feed the armies. And an empire that depended on imported grain to feed its capital was extraordinarily fragile in the face of any disruption of trade routes. Hattusa was burned around 1180 BC. But there's something that archaeologists found, or rather, didn't find, that makes the story even stranger. There are no bodies. There are no signs of a massive massacre at the site. The palaces and temples were looted before being set on fire, but the city seems to have been evacuated orderly, before the final fire. Did the Hittites escape? Did they scatter among the local populations? Did they themselves set fire as they fled so the enemy couldn't use the city? We don't know. What we do know is that in the generations after the collapse, small kingdoms started to appear in northern Syria that used Hittite hieroglyphic writing and called themselves Hittites. Historians call them Neo-Hittites. They might have been descendants of the survivors from Hattusa. The last Hittite king disappeared from history without leaving a trace of his fate. No tomb. No final inscription. Just silence. For decades, the collapse was explained with a single answer: the Sea Peoples. A mysterious horde that supposedly swept through the eastern Mediterranean, destroying civilizations in their path like dominoes. The problem is that this explanation, on its own, doesn't work. And what we know today is much more disturbing and much more interesting. Ramses III's Egyptian records, carved on the walls of the Medinet Habu temple near Luxor, describe them as a coalition of peoples who came from the sea and who had already destroyed the Hittites, Cyprus, and Ugarit. The names that appear in the inscriptions include the Pele-Set, the Tjeker, the Shikalesh, the Denyen, and the Weshish. Their warriors are depicted wearing feathered helmets, carrying iron swords, a metal still rare at the time, and on warships with bird-shaped prows. Here's what no one tells you in the standard documentary: the Pele-Set are almost certainly the future Philistines who would settle in Canaan. The Denyen could be the Danaoi, the name Homer uses for the Greeks in the Iliad. The Shikalesh might be linked to Sicily. And the Tjeker could be the Teucrians, connected to Troy. Think about it. The big villains of the Bronze Age collapse could partly be the Mycenaean Greeks, the predecessors of the biblical Philistines and the ancestors of the Sicilians. Not mysterious invaders from some unknown place. Mediterranean peoples that the system itself had created, and who, now displaced and desperate, became the destructive force that accelerated the collapse of what was left. This is the hypothesis that archaeologist Eric Klein develops in his fundamental work. The Sea Peoples weren't a horde of external invaders swooping down on a prosperous world. They were, in part, refugees and migrants displaced by the very collapse they seemed to cause. Hunger, drought, earthquakes, commercial breakdowns had driven massive population movements that then turned into waves of violence. A human domino effect on a continental scale. Egypt was the only major kingdom that survived the collapse. Ramses III defeated them in 2 battles, one on land in the Levant and one at sea at the mouth of the Nile, around 1175 BC. The Medinet Habu relief shows the naval battle with an astonishing level of detail, Egyptian archers on land shooting at enemy ships as the vessels clash and capsize, with figures falling into the water among spears and shields. It's the first depiction of a naval battle in the history of art. And it's the battle that saved Egypt from disappearing. But even Ramses III's victory was Pyrrhic. Egypt came out of these wars deeply damaged economically. The new kingdom never regained its territorial reach or its power projection. The pharaohs who followed ruled an increasingly impoverished Egypt, internally divided, incapable of maintaining its Asian empires. 3 centuries after the collapse, Egypt was ruled by Libyans, then Nubians, then Assyrians. The heir of the pharaohs who had built the temples of Abu Simbel was now a second-rate state. So, what really brought down the Bronze Age? The answer that comes out of modern archaeology is uncomfortable, because it doesn't have a single villain. It has 5. And they all acted at the same time. First, climate change. A study published in 2013 analyzed fossilized pollen in sediments from the Sea of Galilee and from sources in Cyprus and Turkey. The data show that between 1250 and 1100 BC, there was a prolonged and severe drought across the eastern Mediterranean, of a magnitude not seen in centuries. Crops failed for consecutive decades. Structural hunger weakened all the civilizations at the same time, before any invasion or political catastrophe arrived. Second, earthquakes. Geologist Amos Nur spent decades documenting evidence of a sequence of massive earthquakes that hit the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Mycenae, Tiryns, Messinus, Pylos, several cities in Cyprus, all show layers of seismic destruction in their archaeological strata dated around the same period. The earthquakes didn't destroy the civilization, but they hit populations already weakened by hunger, collapsing infrastructure that no longer had the resources to be rebuilt. Fourth, diseases. The Hittite sources mention a plague that struck the empire for decades, which they called the Plague of Egypt, and was so devastating that it killed at least 2 Hittite kings. Researchers can't identify for sure what the disease was, but the hypothesis that a pandemic hit populations already stressed by hunger, earthquakes, and the breakdown of trade is perfectly consistent with the available evidence. And fifth, the most disturbing factor of all, the system's very complexity. Eric Klein calls it a systemic collapse. Late Bronze Age civilizations were so interdependent, so specialized, so reliant on long-distance trade, that when multiple negative factors hit simultaneously, there was no resilience. The system was highly efficient. But it was as fragile as glass. Let's think about a modern parallel. A global economy that depends on chips made in Taiwan, oil from 3 unstable regions, grain from 2 countries at war, power grids that cross continents, and financial systems that transfer trillions in milliseconds. Super efficient. Hyper-optimized. And extraordinarily vulnerable to simultaneous disruptions. The Late Bronze Age was the first globalized system in history. And it was the first to collapse because of its own complexity. There is something that defines the collapse of the Bronze Age more than destruction, the silence that came after. In Mycenae and Pylos, archaeologists found clay tablets written in Linear B, the Mycenaean writing system, the oldest known form of written Greek, documenting bronze inventories, lists of rowers for the fleet, and records of oil, wine, and grain. In the Palace of Pylos, the records from the last days before the destruction show a desperate mobilization of troops toward the coasts. Someone knew the attack was coming from the sea. Orders were given. They were useless. These tablets were preserved completely by accident. The fire that destroyed the palaces baked the clay and hardened it like ceramic, which is the only thing that saved them from the ravages of time. The fire that destroyed the civilization was also the only thing that preserved its memory. After the collapse, Linear B was never used again. No one wrote it anymore. No one read it anymore. Writing disappeared from Greece for about 400 years. The Greeks called this period the Dark Age, and during that Dark Age not only did writing disappear, palaces, long-distance trade, major construction projects, and the political complexity that had defined Mycenaean civilization also disappeared. This is one of the deepest ironies of the collapse. Mycenaean civilization was destroyed so completely that its own descendants forgot it had ever existed. When Homer composed the Iliad, centuries later, he was narrating events that for his audience were ancestral mythology, not recent history. But in the poem, there are details so precise about Mycenaean geography, rituals, objects, and social structures that modern archaeologists have used the Iliad as a guide for excavations. Homer didn't know he was being accurate. He was passing down a cultural memory that survived the collapse, encapsulated in oral epic, handed down from generation to generation, without writing, until someone could write again and put it on papyrus. There's something deeply human about that, an entire vanished civilization, surviving only in poems that their descendants sang without knowing they were remembering something real. So, what does the collapse of the Bronze Age tell us about ourselves? For a long time, historians treated this collapse as an archaeological curiosity, something that happened to them, to the ancients, to civilizations that could never resemble ours. But the more we study it, the more uncomfortable the comparison becomes. In the 12th century BC, the world was so globalized, so interconnected, so dependent on supply chains that stretched thousands of miles, that when several negative factors coincided, the whole system fell apart. Not over centuries. Within decades. In some cases, within years. And what survived wasn't the most powerful, nor the most technologically advanced. The simplest, most self-sufficient civilizations, the ones that could function without the global system, survived. The cultures of continental Europe that had never been fully integrated into the Bronze Age trading system simply carried on. Archaeologist Eric Klein ended his book on collapse with a warning. He said that modern civilizations, with their dependence on global supply chains, semiconductors made in just a handful of countries, interconnected power grids, and financial systems that communicate in milliseconds, have a structural fragility remarkably similar to that of the late Bronze Age. That a systemic collapse doesn't need a single catastrophic cause, but rather multiple negative factors that amplify each other until they overwhelm the system's ability to respond. He wrote it in 2014. 10 years before a global pandemic, the biggest supply chain crisis in decades, conflicts that disrupted the grain trade that hundreds of millions of people depend on, and a drought that simultaneously affected several of the world's major farming regions. I'm not saying that the modern world is going to collapse like the Bronze Age. Historians are bad prophets, and it's not our job to be. What I am saying is that the collapse of the Bronze Age shows us that extraordinarily sophisticated and complex systems can disappear at a speed that would have seemed impossible to their contemporaries. That progress isn't linear or irreversible. That writing can be lost. That international trade can stop. That entire civilizations can be forgotten so completely that even their own descendants will consider them a myth. 3,200 years ago, someone in Ugarit put a tablet in the oven to ask for help. The fire got there before the messenger. That tablet still exists. It's in the Louvre Museum, in Paris. You can go see it. The question history asks us isn't what destroyed the Bronze Age. The question is whether we're listening.